Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here this morning. This morning's event, Energy in the Presidential Debates, is a continuation of API's Vote for Energy campaign, which is designed to engage both policymakers and voters in the important conversation about our nation's energy future. Launched in January, Vote for Energy is not about a party, it's not about a candidate, but focuses on the opportunities that greater domestic energy production can bring for all Americans, including more jobs, more economic growth, higher government income, government revenue, and greater energy security and national security. In addition to the advertising campaign that I hope you've all seen, the Vote for Energy campaign has involved events in 17 different states around the country, involved a report to both the platform committees for the Republican and Republican and Democratic parties, laying out our view of a national energy policy, participation in both of the party conventions recently, and now this morning's conversation about energy in the presidential debates. So, without further ado, let me introduce the participants in the first part of our conversation this morning, first part of the program. Frank Sesno is professor of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, an Emmy Award-winning journalist with 25 years of experience, 18 of those at CNN. He served as an anchor, White House correspondent, and a Washington bureau chief, and his vast experience interviewing both business and government leaders from around the world. Jack Gerard, of course, is president and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, which means he's my boss. After working for nearly a decade on Capitol Hill and leading two national trade associations, both mining and the American Chemistry Council, Jack joined API in 2008 and oversees an organization that now represents more than 500 companies in the oil and natural gas industry. Join me in welcoming both Frank and Jack this morning.
Thanks, Marty.
Thank you very much, Marty. And Jack, it's great to be here with you. Good to see you again.
You too. Thank you, Frank. Look forward to this.
Our paths have crossed before. I started something at the university called Planet Forward, where we solicit the innovation ideas in the space of energy, climate, sustainability. And so we've heard a lot. In fact, you have a piece that you did up there for us a couple of years ago, and people still flock to that, I think.
I'll bet they do. I'll bet they do.
So let's begin. Jack, all things considered, the American energy story right now is a good one. Production is up. Dependence on imports is down relative to where we've been in the past. We're exporting for the first time since the 1940s. Both candidates have indicated that energy is or should be a key issue in this campaign. So from your perspective and from the industry's perspective, what do you see as the salient issues for this campaign and where you would most like to see the candidates engage in their debate when they're face-to-face and throughout the campaign?
Well, I think, Frank, there are a lot of energy-related issues that are coming up in the campaign now and will continue to come up through the fall, not only at the presidential level, but at the senatorial level, congressional level. And actually, this goes all the way down to state legislatures. We're seeing a lot of activity at the state level now focused on energy. The reason I think they've all come together in this particular environment is because of the job creation potential. You know, in the past, we often have an energy conversation that's in a bit of a void about, well, what should the policy of the country be? But today it's directly tied to job creation, economic recovery. I believe that's why it's so pertinent and relevant to the current dialogue. And therefore, whenever we hear about job creation, if you look at some of the platforms, some of the things the presidential candidates are talking about, it all comes back to that job creation, economic growth. So energy plays a key role in that. And I think that will continue to be the way energy is characterized as we move forward. Oftentimes it's talked about in the environmental context. You hear it talked about less on that side of the equation and much more about what it can do for our country to create jobs, generate revenue, and frankly make us more energy secure.
So when you see these two candidates facing off across one another in that first debate, what do you want, though, to be the jump ball question? Sure, it's about jobs, and they're both trying to take very different positions about those jobs to their dialogue. What do you want to see as the keyed up issue?
Well, our hope and expectation will be that as they talk about economic growth and job creation, that it will come back to energy. If you look at the platforms, one of the key planks, for example, and what Governor Romney's talked about, is using energy as the stimulus to help our economy rebound. And all we have to do is look at situations around the country today. You look at, I like to say, little old North Dakota. North Dakota is not so little anymore, as we all know. The number 2 oil producer in the country, the lowest unemployment rate in the country. So as we get into a debate, we would hope that the moderators and the candidates themselves would come back to the energy question and say, now, how's it relevant today to our economic recovery and job creation? Because it's a great story to tell. And, in fact, much of that story has a lot to do with about what industry has done, what governors have done, what others have done, and a little less about what federal policy's been.
Let's talk about the 2 candidates. In Barack Obama's convention speech, he said, we now control more of our own energy. His administration raised fuel standards, so by the middle of the next decade, cars and trucks will go twice as far in a gallon of gas. His words, double the use of renewable energy, cut oil imports by a million barrels a day, more than any administration in recent history, he said. So that the line of the day for him was, today the United States of America is less dependent on foreign oil than at any time in the last 2 decades. Now, he didn't mention the Keystone Pipeline, drilling on public lands, and the oil companies that get the stuff, although he said in his State of the Union it's time to end the giveaways to the oil companies. So there's a message he stated and a message he didn't state. You've been critical, and API has been critical of Obama's energy policy. What's the disconnect?
Well, I think there are 2 issues, Frank. The first one is there's good news and bad news in that story. The good news in the story is we are producing more energy today than we have in the recent past. But the bad news in that story is much of the demand that we've seen come down, the less reliant on foreign sources in some ways, come because our economy has contracted and has slowed down considerably. So when we move the economy back to full strength, we fully expect demand for energy will continue to rise.
Do you think we're going to go right back to the dependence we had before?
Well, I'm not sure.
All the additional production online?
No, we won't go back to that dependence because so much has occurred onshore today. But we need to think today about our energy future 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. The lead times, particularly in oil and natural gas, are relatively long compared to other energy forms. So we need to make policy today that makes sure we've got adequate supply a decade from now when that demand continues to increase as a result of population growth and economic recovery. Now, from the President's perspective, where he has been, we're very supportive of an all-of-the-above energy strategy. Unfortunately, we don't believe the deeds match the words.
The Obama administration's deeds match the words.
The President talks a lot about, well, we have a need for everything. We've got to have oil and natural gas. We've got to have renewables. We're for that entire agenda, but we have to look closely at the facts when we talk about increase of oil production. That has by and large occurred on private and state land. If you look at the federal land where the President has control and can determine its future, we're down in our production, and we're down in our leasing and permitting on federal land.
They've talked about opening more leases in the deep waters, opening more leases out west.
Yeah, well, they talk about that, but the reality is it's contracted from where it used to be. Our production coming out of the Gulf of Mexico today is off about 20% from where it was projected to be at this point. So our hope and our effort, and as we dialogue with the White House, as we continue to do quite often, is to get the actions to match the words. The vision is established by the President, as talked about, is a good vision for the country. We need more energy efficiency. We're doing well as a nation, but we can do better. We need more renewables of all forms. But we shouldn't overlook the fundamental fact that oil and natural gas today provides 62% of all the energy we consume. And by their own estimates, 30 years from now, we will still be over 50% of the energy equation. So what are we doing about producing our own oil and natural gas and not relying on economic contraction or relying on what the governors are doing in their states to increase that production?
So specifically, and beyond opening up more land for leasing, or is that it, what do you want Obama, the President, to say and do, say in the debate, do if he's reelected?
Well, I think there's 2 areas that they could really step forward and really change the course of what's been discussed in the past. The first one is opening up more access. We have been limited to, by and large, about 15% of the outer continental shelf when we look at the OCS around the country. That's all been in the Gulf of Mexico. But there's broad support today to begin looking at the South Atlantic. Let's just take Virginia, for example. You have 2 U.S. Senate Democratic members strongly supportive of looking and producing off the coast of Virginia, coupled with their Republican governor. There is political support there to begin to reach out and say, there are other parts of the U.S. where we haven't been that we could go to bring more energy online. But the second phase, the second dimension of it, Frank, I think is very important, is the regulatory regimes. Historically, oil and natural gas has by and large been regulated at the state level. But you look at some of our breakthrough technologies like hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling. There is currently an effort underway at the federal level with 10 different departments and agencies that could potentially regulate this activity. There is no need to overburden, to lay an additional level of regulation that will conflict and confuse what the states have moved quickly to address to protect the environment, protect our people.
I want to come back to fracking and the regulation.
So access regulatory.
Access regulatory. And one other question on Keystone in terms of the president. Blocked for a time with some movement in the southern tier of the pipeline. Where do you think Keystone would go if Barack Obama is reelected?
Well, I'm a little reluctant to speculate on that merely because I was absolutely wrong in the first round, wondering how in the world anybody could reject the Keystone XL pipeline. As Canadian Prime Minister Harper said, this is a no-brainer. Now, when we look at it from the U.S. perspective, we set aside 20,000 good-paying jobs. Those jobs happened to be under a project labor agreement, so they were all organized labor that would have gotten all those jobs. It came clear across the country. We have industries, companies, and people in 49 out of 50 states who had a piece of the Keystone XL pipeline. So when you look at the fundamental economics around it, not to mention our continued reliance or increasing our reliance, if you will, on our Canadian partners, it was hard to believe the president said no. So I'm reluctant to predict what he might do if reelected. I can tell you there's a compelling case for it. It was 3 years in environmental review, 2 exhaustive reviews. Secretary Clinton, who really has primary leadership in this area, said publicly she fully expected they would approve the pipeline. And then out of the blue, totally unexpected to many, including some of the president's biggest supporters, he said no.
But don't you believe that everything that you've heard from Barack Obama, publicly and elsewise, supports thinking that he would, in fact, greenlight this pipeline? Once back in, thinking about the politics, thinking about where he is on production. He's very favorable towards production.
Well, again, we want the deeds to match the words. I'm shocked that he would run this risk in an election cycle to not approve the Keystone XL pipeline, which gives me pause as to what he might do if reelected. And the reason I say that, Frank, is for all the reasons you've just mentioned, it should have been approved. It should have been a quick decision. In my view, what should have happened, the president should have said, absolutely, this makes energy sense, it makes economic sense, it makes job creation sense, and he should have gone out publicly and said, I'm going to make this decision today, I'm going to create these jobs, I'm going to help with our energy infrastructure, our energy security, and I'm all about job creation. Unfortunately, he didn't do that, so it's tough to say what he'll do.
So let's talk about Mitt Romney for a minute and his convention speech. So if you look at his convention speech and what he had to say on energy, it actually wasn't very much. Beyond assailing Barack Obama for what he called his assault on coal and gas and oil that will send energy and manufacturing jobs to China. Were you disappointed that Mitt Romney didn't have more to say on energy in his speech, where tens of millions of Americans watching?
No, I think if you look at the 5 points that he mentioned that he would do as part of his vision for the country, the number one point is energy. And it's tied to, as I mentioned earlier, job creation, economic recovery. So I believe that Governor Romney and his team sees energy as a major stimulus to help our economy recover. And so what we're seeing today on state and private lands, I believe he and his people would pursue an agenda that would do that as well on federal lands. So we'd see more access. Hopefully they would take a close look at the regulatory agencies and realize primacy in this area should rest with the states, should be focused in those areas, the governors and others. They live in these communities. They know more about the local topography and geology than anybody else does. There's really no reason for Washington to fly in and start second-guessing what the locals are doing in terms of protecting their environment, protecting their people.
What he didn't talk about, but in his convention speech, which of course he's talked about elsewhere, is regulatory reform, as you mentioned, the increased production he wants, the emphasis on shale gas to increase production there, and to give states more of a role in the permitting and regulatory process. In terms of his estimate of the number of jobs that this would produce and the impact that would have on the energy sector, is that your agenda, or do you see a distinction with what he's calling for? What would the impact be specifically?
Well, if you look at both President Obama and Governor Romney, I think both of them are saying the right things in terms of what it could do for job creation and the potential. The president talks about 600,000 jobs in the natural gas industry. We believe the numbers are much bigger than that. And if you look at a lot of third-party estimates, in our second panel today, a lot of these experts who absorb this material look at it often. There's potential. Our own analysis shows in the next 7 years, we estimate we could create another 1 million jobs in the oil and gas-related industries. Now, that's coupled with the 9.2 million that we currently support today. So this is a big deal. You know, when you look at the overall economic conditions in the country through this recessionary state, the economy's lost 5 million jobs roughly. In the oil and gas sector, the most recent estimates show we've created about 110,000 at that same time. So we're the one bright spot in the economy, if you will, that's the contrarian view that's in a positive direction. And we believe you could multiply that with the right public policy. And that's why we're pushing so hard on things like our Vote for Energy campaign, presidential debate, and others. I think the energy issue has elevated more than it ever has in the country. The question is, can we keep it up there, keep the conversation on it, tie it back to what the public is focused most on, and that's job creation, economic recovery.
Mitt Romney says his plan could add over time north of 3 million jobs through the energy sector. But some who've looked at this say that job trajectory would exist anyway, that a good chunk of it would exist under the Obama plan through energy efficiency and other things that he is calling for. So how much of a distinction in their energy trajectories and job creation is there really?
Well, I think, Frank, it really comes back to deeds and words. When we hear what people say they want to do versus what they do, it's very different. For example, under the Romney plan, there's a full expectation there'll be a lot more federal land production. Currently, under the Obama administration, we're on a downward trajectory. So that's a big distinction. That's a big change.
So you're saying Obama's talk about jobs is just wrong?
No, I think the president's very sincere in his efforts to talk about jobs. We just wonder why he hasn't taken action to create jobs, particularly as it relates to oil and gas production.
An enemy of the oil industry?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think he's progressively moving forward and understanding more what the American people understand. And that is that energy production in the United States is about job creation and making us more energy secure. In a recent poll, a survey we just conducted, over 70% of the American people support more oil and natural gas development right here in the United States. Over 90% of the American public understand oil and gas production equals jobs. So that's the distinction. That's the difference. If you look back over the president's tenure, in one of his early State of the Union addresses, he referenced our industry as a yesterday industry. And now today he talks about the need, particularly he focuses on natural gas, which is good. We view that as progress. We've moved from being yesterday's industry to a reality check that we are indeed not only the here and now energy form, but the future energy that will fuel this economy and help us get back on track.
Let me talk to you about the Vote for Energy campaign that you've done. You started this back in January.
Yep.
What has been the impact, do you believe? Why did you do it? Why did you start? And what's been the impact of it?
Well,
this is not just for people, I'm sure most in the room are aware of this, but perhaps those who are watching in their homes or elsewhere are not. This was an advertising campaign that you began back in January. To present the case and the facts as you see them of the energy industry and oil and gas in particular to the American public.
Well, first of all, Frank, and I think for most who've already seen some of our ads or some of our social media activities, we believe it's been successful. Why has it been successful? Because we continue the dialogue and to elevate the discussion surrounding energy. As Marty mentioned in the opening comments, it's not about a political party. It's not about a political candidate. Energy should not be a partisan issue. Over the years, it has evolved to that, where many perceive it as a partisan question. Well, I'm for these forms of energy, you're for those forms of energy. We need it all. We truly need an all-of-the-above strategy. So what we've done with Vote for Energy is we've gone clear across the country, and we're continuing to not only inform, to educate around the questions of energy, but we're trying to encourage folks to engage. We have what we call I'm an energy voter. These are individuals who recognize the role of energy in our domestic economy and society and what it could do to help us at this very difficult economic time. And so as we roll this out, we believe it's been successful, and we will continue. This isn't about the presidential discussions or races. People shouldn't get that confused. It is just one more way of our outreach to educate around energy for one primary purpose. That is that an informed electorate will produce the best and sound public policy. At the end of the day, it's all about the voters and educating the people. That's what this campaign is all about, and I believe you can already see movement in that area.
So where do you see movement?
Well, we see movement. If you look at some of the votes on Capitol Hill, you see strong support, bipartisan support for the Keystone XL pipeline. You see continued growth in opposition to some of the select, we believe, punitive tax proposals of the president to punish the oil and natural gas industry. So we believe over time this is a long-term effort. This isn't all about this year. This is something we will continue in various ways to engage the American people. Because ultimately, just one last thought there, Congress is a lagging indicator, right?
In so many ways.
Well, I'll be guarded in what I'm saying about that.
I know what Mark Twain said about Congress.
But they're a lagging indicator, and they're going to react to what they believe the people believe.
All right. Well, then let me ask you about that, because
Please.
I looked up some other polling, and I see a Gallup poll from August that and you know, the Obama vision and the Romney vision are in areas they sound a lot alike, but they're really very different, at least in emphasis and in terms of the exploration and production, which you were talking about. But in a Gallup poll from August 22nd, 53% approved of the Obama energy agenda, 40% approved of the Romney agenda. In a recent Pew poll from a couple months earlier, 52% say they favor developing alternative sources first, 39% expanding exploration and production of oil, coal, natural gas, 9% say they don't know. So it sounds like, despite your best efforts, and maybe there's been movement in these numbers nonetheless, the public is still on the, all of the above, but go for the renewables first.
Well, it's interesting. If you dive
and that's a fraction of what we use.
You're right. If you dive deeper, look closely at the numbers, and this goes back to our vote for energy and our need to continue this dialogue. Because when the public understands 62% of the energy we consume is oil and natural gas, 30 years from now it'll still be over 50%, you begin to see those attitudes adjust and shape. Again, a well-informed electorate is the best way to produce good, sound public policy. So while we all say all the above is good, there's clearly an emphasis on one end of that continuum on the part of both of these candidates. We believe as we educate the American people, those numbers will continue to rise in broader support for a true all the above, with a recognition that reality is such oil and gas will not only play a major role today, but well into the future. We're actually heartened by those numbers when you look at them overall, because the direction is clearly moving to a broader understanding and a recognition of the role oil and gas plays. Now, that's not to downplay these other forms of energy. The oil and natural gas industry are major leaders in investing in alternative renewable forms of energy. So we are truly energy companies that practice what we preach in an all-of-the-above strategy. So we're heartened that there's movement in these numbers.
Talk about Congress for a minute. What are the three things that the oil and gas industry most wants from the next Congress?
Well, I think the first thing we want is do no harm. First thing we want them to do is make sure they don't go out and go off half-cocked on some initiative that essentially chills our ability to restore our economy and to put it back.
Like what?
Well, regulatory activities, proposals on
no more regulation.
Well, no. We need robust regulatory activities. We're very supportive of having an appropriate regulatory regime. What we don't want is provisions that are unnecessary, that duplicate, that require 4, 5, 6, 7 years to get a permit to produce. And you see this direct contrast in what the states do and what the feds do. Just read a report the other day. Somebody suggested in the state of Ohio and North Dakota you can get a permit to drill for oil and gas in 15 to 30 days. It takes the federal government over 300 days. Now, why is that? Well, there are processes involved. There's regulatory activity involved. And there's really no reason that it should take 4, 5, 6 years to accomplish those things. So the first thing, do no harm. But the second thing we ought to look at, and this is an important distinction, the President today has authority under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to open up a lot of these areas to exploration, to production. The President could unilaterally essentially do that on his own. We think it might need a little encouragement by the Congress and others to remind him, hey, there's opportunity here. We ought to pursue it. So those are the couple things.
So do no harm.
Access. And the third piece is a combination of regulatory taxation policy. There's a lot of talk about tax reform. We believe tax reform should come about. We've got to be more competitive as a society, as a country, on a global basis. But the worst thing to do is to pick winners and losers in that tax reform debate and penalize good industries like oil and natural gas that are creating a lot of jobs.
I said I'd come back to some of the regulatory elements, and I want to do that in just a minute. But first, I want to wander beyond our borders for just a second, because this is really a global conversation when you talk about energy.
Absolutely.
It's just inevitable. And what's happening internationally is very challenging right now. We've got the uncertainty around the Iranian standoff. We've got the Iraqi supply line increasing and improving. Libya is trying to rebuild. Some of the Mexican oil is on a downward slope because of poor investment there. Where do you see the global oil and energy supply going as you look at the next 5 and 10 years?
Well, I think, Frank, first of all, when we look at the demand on a global basis, the United States, particularly for liquid fuels, is projected to be about flat. So if we look at demand in our society, the energy efficiency efforts that are coming online with auto efficiency standards and others, we're relatively flat, though we'll need about, it's estimated over the next 25, 30 years, about 15% more energy due to population growth, et cetera. But on a global basis, as we look at China, as we look at India and some of these emerging markets, it's estimated, depending upon whose view you believe, anywhere from 30 to 50% more energy is going to be required over the next few decades. So clearly we've got to produce more when we look at it in that global context. Now, the real question for the United States is, what role will we play in that global equation? We look at the unrest that's taking place in the Middle East today. We look at these emerging markets which just have an insatiable appetite for more and more energy, more oil and natural gas, more coal, more, all of the above. But the real question for us is, where will we be when that dust settles 2 decades from now? Experts believe, the New York Times ran a great piece about 6 or 7 months ago now on the front page, and it pointed out, based on what we have in the United States today, we are a very energy-rich nation.
Right.
A lot of people don't understand that. In many ways, we have more resources than most of these other major producers around the world. But it's all about public policy. But the New York Times piece made an interesting point and drew a conclusion that if we get our policy right, we will literally reshape the geopolitical dynamic on a global basis. And the conclusion by them and others was that the United States could become the new Middle East. So when we think about that, as we project forward 2, 3, 4 decades, we really have the ability to take our destiny in our own hands. We often talk about reliance on outside sources. We often hear, well, gee, we can't do much about that, therefore we need to go find other forms of energy. We can do a lot about it. We've got the technology, we've got the resource. All we need is the political will through public policy to say, let's focus right here at home. That's a big game changer.
Do you really see the United States as the next Middle East in terms of oil and natural gas?
Absolutely.
Natural gas for sure. Oil?
Oil as well. Look at what's going on in North Dakota today.
North Dakota is Saudi Arabia?
North Dakota is the number 2 oil producer in the United States. 10 years ago, no one would have predicted that.
No one.
But look at our technology. Through hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling today, we can access some of the unconventional fuels that we haven't been able to for many years. And all we have to do is look at North Dakota as a little case study, look at Pennsylvania, look at Ohio. All these are potential major energy producers. I was down in North Carolina a few weeks ago and gave a speech before the convention, was down there again during the convention. North Carolina is now putting together, considering a regulatory regime, because it's estimated they have a significant natural gas supply. Who would have thought just a few years ago? We are an energy-rich nation. We've just got to get the policy right, and we can reshape that global geopolitical.
Well, I think Boone Pickens has a bunch of windmills in his backyard because
he
didn't plan on some of this stuff.
I'll let you call Boone.
It's a big backyard. Yeah, right. You talked about fracking before, and you talked about regulation. I mean, one of the things that opponents would say to you is it's fine to let the states regulate. They've traditionally regulated to a fairly well on a lot of this stuff anyway. But when you have aquifers that cross state boundaries, when you have people concerned about what's going in and what's coming out in terms of chemicals and a variety of pollutants with uncertain at best disclosure for many of the companies, that you need something more than a patchwork quilt of regulation. And that, in fact, you could, in some ways, arguably operate more efficiently if you had a national regulatory structure. What's your response?
Let me address that in two ways. First, who is most interested in protecting their environment? Washington, D.C., or the local people who live in those communities?
Yeah, but the local people in those communities will often tell you that they're overrun by the steamroller of an oil boom, of a rush that comes in the door.
Governors, state legislatures, they know better than anybody what they want to do to protect their environment and allow their people to grow and to flourish. So that's a myth that I would challenge on the part of those who'd like to suggest this is a problem. But the second one, which is perhaps more important, and it gets back to what you've been doing and all your great work, let's get to the facts. The process of hydraulic fracturing has been used in the United States now for over 65 years. It has been developed and improved on considerably, now coupled with hydraulic fracturing. We have drilled over 1.2 million wells using this technology, and there has never been a case of groundwater contamination as a result of hydraulic fracturing. Now think about that. There has never been a case of contamination, yet if you read a lot of the media and others, you'd think we had a major problem. So it comes right back.
Fire in my water tap, right?
Yeah, and as others have gone back and basically shown there was fire in that water tap long before the oil and natural gas industry showed up. There's a lot of natural occurrences and other things with natural methane gases, etc., that are already there. So let's get the facts right. Let's go back to a factual understanding, and then let's develop regulatory regimes based on the facts. I know of no other industry, no other modern technology that has had a great track record like we have with hydraulic fracturing.
All right, so let me ask you this.
And yet we have 10 federal agencies now looking to regulate it.
So what do you think is the most important piece of regulation that needs to be put in place to assure people at state and local level, however it comes in, that this natural gas fracking boom is safe for their water, safe for their land, safe for their community?
Well, all we have to do to get the right answer to that is go ask the Democratic governor of the state of Colorado, Governor Hickenlooper. He has put a robust regulatory regime in place that many consider a model for the rest of the country. They've already acted. They've already moved. They're not waiting for the federal government. In fact, those governors are very concerned. Hickenlooper, Democratic governor in Colorado. Schweitzer in Montana, another Democratic governor, say, Washington, don't come in here and complicate our lives. We've got this regulated. We're taking good care of it. The list goes on. Kasich in Ohio, Corbett in Pennsylvania. We're now working with the Democratic governor in North Carolina on developing their regimes. The states move much quicker. They've developed robust ways to make sure they protect the environment. And that's what we need, a regulatory regime that's predictable, that's handled on a local basis because topography and geology changes considerably. That's already taken place while Washington's still talking about it and considering it and studying it. The states are moving ahead, and they're doing a good job of it.
Let me ask you a few other questions, kind of covering the waterfront in the few minutes that we've got left, and I know you'll be doing the roundtable and taking other questions a bit later as well. A lot of talk about and a lot of advertising from some of the auto companies on electric vehicles or plug-in hybrids and all of this kind of stuff. Where do you think the future of the auto industry lies in terms of trying to create these environmentally friendly vehicles, high-mileage vehicles? Where do you see that innovation going?
Well, I think they'll continue to improve, and regulatory activity, some of the auto efficiency standards worked out between the administration and the autos, I think they will continue to increase their performance, become more energy efficient, and there will be other forms of autos that will come online. For example, the all-electric vehicle, etc. But let me just remind folks, those, number one, haven't proven yet to be marketable in the sense of being cost-effective for many consumers. As we were talking about earlier, many consumers prefer other forms of vehicles, larger vehicles, more powerful vehicles, particularly those who work on farms and ranches, rural areas, etc. So I believe there will continue to be progress. But one thing I'd remind you of, which comes back to the role of oil and natural gas, in order to improve those technologies, in some instances to make those vehicles lighter so they become more fuel efficient, it still has a petroleum base in it. The plastics that we use in automobiles, they're derived from petroleum products. People talk about, well, where are we going to get the energy to fuel these automobiles, electric vehicles? The wind turbines that are made of composites, they come from oil and natural gas products. So overall, we're here to stay for the long haul, not only in areas such as fuel efficiency and autos and others, but in the foundation of this nation and what we do on a daily basis to restore manufacturing strength, to produce the very vehicles you're talking about.
Would you buy an EV?
Would I what?
Would you buy an EV yourself?
We'll buy whatever the market bears and whatever I can get my large family in, Frank. That's the challenge for me.
It is a large
It always comes back to that at the end of the day.
One of the interesting things that some of the auto companies have done, in particular Volkswagen, for example, is rather than pursuing a sort of a hybrid strategy, they've pursued a diesel strategy, and they've got incredibly efficient vehicles with diesel. Do you see diesel playing a bigger role in the fuel mix of this country, transportation fuel mix of this country?
It might. I think that's hard to predict. As you know, in the European model, there's much more diesel.
Everything's diesel.
Used over there. Much higher cost of fuel over there, by and large, due to public policy, taxation policy. So I think it's too early to predict, but I think there will be a lot of innovation, a lot of entrepreneurship that will come into play that will really determine the future.
How about CNG vehicles? How about putting compressed natural gas and running our vehicles off of that fuel? You see that in the
we think that's
future?
a great option, and we think it's a good use of clean-burning natural gas. Where we'll take exception to some of that is some believe the government should intervene and now pick winners and losers. That's where we draw the line and say, no, we shouldn't have the government picking winners and losers. We see the track record of a government playing winners and losers. We think public policies, generic, uniform policies should be in place, and then we ought to let the market dictate those terms. That's how we become more energy efficient. That's how we become better as a society.
Some have talked about natural gas, this great natural gas boom we've got, as a transition, as a bridge fuel to this brave new world that's out there. Do you see it as a transition fuel, and over what period of time does it take to cross the bridge?
Well, I think, how you define transition is probably the big question there, because we'll be around for 30, 40, 50 years clearly as a dominant fuel. What happens after that will be unclear based on technology. But let me just say it took us 100 years in the United States to get off wood as our primary form of energy. So when we look at these transitions, we need to think long term, and that's one area I think we've made a big mistake in this country. And in the current discourse, it's too limited. We're talking about, well, let's show up today, let's immediately move to these other forms of energy. You can't do that in 3 or 4, 5, 6 years. We have to think 30, 40, 50, 60 years. So as we talk about transition, if it's a realistic transition, multiple decades, yes, our policy today will be much more thoughtful to help bend that curve than it will be to have these gut reactions, if you will, we versus them. We're going to need it all. We need a true all-of-the-above strategy.
We do need a true all-of-the-above strategy. And I think one of the interesting things and one of the interesting challenges, especially in the heat of a presidential debate, but it's been happening for a long time, it's not unique to this moment, is to get people off of the, seeing this discussion as a binary discussion, a binary choice between either you drill baby drill,
yep,
or it's all renewable and you're destroying the planet. There's a place in between. And it's an interesting position that you've charted out for yourself if that's the conversation that you're trying to lead. I started with the discussion about the presidential debate. I want to end with that in the few minutes that are left. If you were the moderator of the presidential debate, what questions would you ask these candidates about this topic?
Well, I would phase it in 2 dimensions. The first one is I would tie it directly to job growth and economic recovery. What role do you see energy playing in an effort to bring us back, to help our economy, to provide the fuel our citizens need at affordable, reliable rates? And then the second part of that is what will you do about that to make sure the energy policy of the United States will allow us to contribute to that job creation? One of the things we haven't touched on here is the huge impact on consumers. Let me give you just one case in point. Look at what's happened in the natural gas markets. That wasn't a result of public policy at the federal level. the marketplace moved that forward due to hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, governors who were anxious to have that job creation. The price of natural gas has dropped from roughly $13 4 years ago, to about $3 today, right?
Yeah.
Look what it's done for consumers. It's now estimated our consumers save $500 million a day in consumer costs as a result of that drop. So when we think about job creation, let's produce our own energy, because what does that do? It puts more supply in the marketplace. We can't control the events in the Middle East. We can't control what the Chinese or the Indians will do in their emerging insatiable appetite to produce energy. But what we can do is contribute more to the supply equation that has not only global implications in the crude oil market, but particularly domestic implications as it relates to things like natural gas. And at the end of the day, it's all about the American people. It's all about the consumers. And there's a great story to tell there, but it's all tied back to what are we going to do about it and what policies will we implement. So that's what I'd ask the candidates.
So since you're doing such a good job as a debate moderator, what would you'd have one candidate who says it's time to end all the tax breaks that the oil companies get. Another candidate who says, wait a minute, these companies need the same breaks that other companies get, whether it's in terms of what they've invested in their equipment and all the rest. What question would you ask them about tax policy?
Well, the first response I'd give is...
The country's watching.
I understand. and this would be a great response, to ask one of the candidates on the stand that night to say, tell me specifically what tax provisions that apply to oil and natural gas only that aren't consistent with other forms of taxes in the code that you're talking about for oil and gas, and why do you believe we should change the tax policy for 4 companies in the United States to treat them differently than all other similarly situated companies as it relates to tax policy? Because that's what the President's proposal does. He talks about, we shouldn't provide these extra benefits, subsidies as he calls them. The oil and gas industry gets no subsidies in the tax code. Let me give you one case in point. One of the provisions he's talking about in repealing for 4 companies is what we call Section 199. It's a manufacturing deduction. It applies to General Electric, Apple Computer, the New York Times, and everybody else. His proposal literally denies that for 4 companies. That provision was put in place to encourage job creation, job retention here in the United States. Now, how can you justify repealing that for 4 companies that are shown to be the one bright spot in our economy in creating jobs at a time we're struggling mightily? That's the specific question that needs to be asked, and to hear some justification for, in our view, a lot of the rhetoric that surrounds that dialogue.
Well, we'll have to watch the debate to see how it goes. I wonder if that question will be asked. I think I know how it will be answered. But I think that this is a very important conversation, and I'm very grateful that you asked me to come and do this, because for some time I've been trying to get these facts out. I share your interest in making sure that the country is exposed to all sides of this discussion to understand just how complex the energy equation is and what's at stake for it. So, Jack, thank you very much. And
thank you, Frank, and thank you for doing this today. We appreciate it. It's helpful.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Jack, for being here, and thanks again for everybody. As we take a minute, going to change. Please, come on down from the stage as we go ahead and get ready for the panel that will be coming on here. Just to remind everybody that Jack will actually be rejoining the panel when they get to the Q&A section. And you do have, speaking of Q&A, there are question cards that you've got at your seats. Please feel free to fill those out and hand those to some of the staff that will be here in the audience. Again, as we make the changes here and the panelists come up, let me just take a moment. What I'd like to do is I'm going to introduce the moderator for our panel, and then he in turn will introduce the rest of the panelists once they're up there. But we're very pleased to have Charlie Ebinger join us here this morning as a moderator. Charlie is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution and serves as a director of their energy security initiative. Charlie's got more than 35 years of experience in international and domestic energy markets and the geopolitics of energy, and has served as advisor to more than 50 governments on their own energy sectors. So please welcome Mr. Ebinger and the other panelists as they join us here in just a moment. And again, if we could, I know maybe I'm going a little fast for the group here, but again, I thought it was a great conversation we had here. And if you just join me again in thanking both Frank Sesno and Jack Gerard for the first part of the program, and we'll get set in just a moment. Charlie.
Take care.
We go up now.
Sure. But this is non-political. This is non-political, so. Swear to God, so far out.
I'm going to go over on the left wing here. Yeah, I'm with you.
I'll have to do our other two panelists.
This gets hug. Hey, Bob. You're one of the 47%. 47%.
We have our other two panelists.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You hiding out there, Frank?
Not really.
Where's Kevin? Kevin, are you out there?
They'll find him.
I can't see with the lights, but if Kevin Smith's out there, we'd love to have him join us.
There he is.
How do you pronounce your name? Isakower. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to have you here this morning. I'm Charlie Ebinger, Director of the Energy Security Initiative at the Brookings Institution, and I want to thank API for inviting me today to moderate this panel. I think it's going to be a hard act to follow after the one we just had, but we'll see where we can go. I'm going to not fully introduce all of the speakers because you have their biographies, and I think you'd rather have time spent hearing from them. But let me quickly introduce our panel because I think we have an outstanding group. And please excuse my voice. I'm coming off a bronchial condition, so I apologize if I sound a bit raspy. To my immediate right is Kyle Isakower, who's the Vice President of Regulatory and Economic Policy at API. He has a very distinguished role in the oil and gas industry as an expert on tax policies affecting the industry, as well as major experience on all kinds of environmental regulations affecting the industry. And I think he will be, particularly in the area of air quality, I think he'll be bringing interesting expertise to the panel. And the fact that he actually has a degree in scientific biology, geology, which is always an addition in a panel, where too often we have policy experts that forget the science of some of these critical issues. Next to him is Dr. Mike Mandel, who's the Chief Economic Strategist at the Progressive Policy Institute. For those that you don't know, the Progressive Policy Institute, I think it's one of the leading organizations that tries truly on the issues it looks at, tries to be an honest broker, not take a definitive policy position, and I think its work is respected certainly throughout Washington and the broader community. We also have the advantage that Mike is one of the bright young economists in the energy area, and some of his textbooks are used at a number of universities. On my immediate left is Kevin Smith, the Chief Executive Officer of SolarReserve. I'm delighted as one of our renewable panelists. I'm sure we'll get an interesting point of view from him. But his company is particularly interesting
because they have nearly 3,000 megawatts of solar power in development across the United States and internationally. And one of their plants between Carson City and Las Vegas is fascinating because it is one of the few solar plants in the United States that has continuous power owing to a very effective storage technology, which makes it the whole issue of intermittency take on a different light. Mr. Smith earned his MBA in finance from the University of Chicago, and he holds a mechanical engineering degree from Purdue University and is a licensed professional engineer. And in 2008, he received the Outstanding Mechanical Engineering Award from Purdue. And on Kevin's left is a dear old friend of mine, Frank Verrasto, who actually runs a program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies that I was the original director of many years ago. But Frank has taken that program to great new heights. He has a very distinguished background in government, dealing with both international and domestic policy issues. He has a distinguished record also as a private sector person, both at Tosco, which, for those of you old enough to remember, used to be the largest independent refiner in the country, and was senior vice president for Pennzoil, where he was particularly responsible for government affairs, both on the company's domestic and international issues, as well as in corporate planning, risk assessment, and international negotiations. So that is our panel. Let me just make a couple opening challenges, throw out a few issues. We're here to hear from them, but I want to be a bit provocative and see if we can turn some of their queries and comments to deal with some of these. In the last several days, two people well known in Washington, Robert McNally, a former government official in Republican administrations, and David Goldwyn, a former government official in Democratic administrations, had a piece in the Financial Times which really caught my attention because I think it added a dimension to this energy debate which perhaps has not been represented in our meeting so far today. And they were asked to say what would be the differences, exactly what we're looking at today, between a Romney and an Obama administration. And they concluded, very interestingly, that they thought there would be very little difference. And that was, of course, because of the fact that the nation finally has to deal with the fact that we have an unprecedented, massive, and sustained budgetary and fiscal challenge, which will simply make it almost impossible, if we deal with those challenges, for any administration to launch any kind of bold new initiatives, certainly that have fiscal or monetary implications, and that indeed it may be difficult even for those companies that have such benefits today to sustain them under what will be a brutally fought battle as we look at potentially trying to cut $4 trillion from our now $16 trillion deficit. Let me now just pose a few areas that I think might be worthy of inquiry, and then we'll turn quickly to our panelists. First, we've heard this morning on questions relating to environmental regulations on energy, including shale gas. Haven't heard as much on coal, but I was wondering if any of our panelists during the course of our discussion might want to address how the candidates see the burning of fossil fuels and the trade-off between energy and climate reduction. We heard Jack talk about the tremendous energy resources the United States has. I constantly remind people, I know coal is a dirty word in many places, but we still get nearly 40% of our electricity, a little less, I guess, today, from coal. I still believe if we look around the world that India and China are going to continue to burn coal regardless of what we do, which means the global greenhouse gas problem is not going to go away unless you're a climate denier and don't think the problem exists in the first place. But this whole issue between energy security and climate and CO2 reduction is something we might want to examine. The whole concept that we hear of a North American energy independence, is this actually a worthy goal? Is it possible? What is the difference between what is already included in NAFTA and what might be implied by Governor Romney's proposal? Nuclear power. Haven't heard hardly any discussion. Are there differences between the candidates on nuclear power? Is anyone really looking at the prospects for small-scale modular reactors and what role the government might play in accelerating their development? Because I think at least some of us who have looked at nuclear power for many years believe that you cannot have a serious discussion about climate change and not address the issue of the future of nuclear power and attendantly the future of nuclear waste management, which we have now punted as a nation for over 30 years. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Should this be used exclusively in a supply emergency, or with gasoline prices where they are today, might we want to help the average consumer see lower prices by potentially using the reserve? U.S. economic competitiveness. While prospects for greater supply are good at reasonable prices, to what extent will this impact overall economic competitiveness? And this relates to the following issue, energy exports. With the glut of natural gas we now have, we have a battle royal between those people who formerly were importing natural gas and now want to convert those facilities to exports versus a strong manufacturing sector that argues we should keep the gas at home for cheap petrochemical feedstocks and cheap industrial exports and export value-added services. Where do the two candidates come out on this, and what do the panelists think about this? Does anybody care about the climate issue anymore? And to what extent our whole panoply of energy policies would relate and perhaps change if climate change were once again on the agenda? Do the candidates believe that we might de facto enact a carbon tax if a deal could be cut to reduce the federal income tax accordingly in exchange for our carbon caps? Do the candidates have differing views on alternate energies and energy efficiencies, especially for automobiles? How can the U.S. continue to fund overall energy research and development given the massive federal budget deficit? How do energy priorities stack up against other national priorities? And here I would challenge Jack a bit to ask, when we say that the industry can't give up oil and gas tax credits, well, who's going to give up food stamps? Or who's going to give up things that are equally important to other constituencies? And this in the context of the overall budget deficit, which looms right around us come January 1st of next year. What international long-term projects do the candidates support, if any? Have they even thought about them? Things such as fusion, things such as carbon capture and sequestration. Talk about something that might change the job front if we could actually prove that CCS can be done both commercially and technically. As the U.S. becomes more energy independent, what does that imply for U.S. military posture in the Middle East? When Washington finally has the dawn of the reality that increasingly the market for Middle Eastern oil is Asia and not the United States and not Europe, does this mean a change in our own geopolitical interests in the Middle East, our support of Israel, our support of Saudi Arabia? Or do these countries increasingly look for support and even military assistance from their new commercial partners in places like India, China, and what does that portend for the United States? And finally, what are the energy, economic, political, and military strategies each candidate would enact if the Straits of Hormuz were closed by Iran, and hopefully not before the presidential election? So with that, let me turn to our panelists, and I guess we're supposed to proceed alphabetically. So I guess that means, Kyle, you're up first.
Okay. Well, thanks, Charles. And I hope that when we get into the discussion, we can touch on many of the issues that you've just raised. In terms of my opening remarks, I want to return to some of the discussion that Jack had with Frank earlier. As they noted, both candidates see the energy sector as a positive way to get our economy moving again and to create jobs. And that's a good thing. There's a lot of good justification for doing that. However, there are differences. Despite the fact that both candidates used, their top-level rhetoric, they talks about we need it all of the above strategies. There are some very serious differences between their positions. So when I'm watching the debates, I'm going to be looking to see just how much light they show on those differences between their two plans. Specifically, I'm going to be looking for three things. First of all, when discussing job creation, obviously you're talking about private investment. Both candidates recognize that it's going to require private investment to really make a difference in terms of job creation in this country. The question is, how do you incentivize that job creation? And that's where I think the candidates differ. Are you talking about incentivizing job creation and private investment through government spending, or are you talking about doing it through creating a pro-energy development policies that encourage investment, encourage private investment without the federal government putting its own dollars out there? Secondly, do they appropriately characterize the scale of various energy sectors? A very, very important point. We often in the energy industry, we get into this, we talk about job creation so much, and we talk about thousands of jobs here, thousands of jobs there. But there's a big difference between thousands of jobs and hundreds of thousands of jobs. And obviously the various energy sectors are of various sizes and various scales. As Jack mentioned, 62% of the energy demand in the United States currently met by the oil and gas industry. Obviously, the scale of our industry is much larger than some of the other industries. Kevin, for example, the solar industry is a small industry, very important industry, and one that we want to see grow. But rapid growth in renewables sector does not necessarily going to create the type of job creation that growth in a much larger sector like oil and gas can provide. And then lastly, are they talking about energy as a zero-sum game? Are we talking about increasing energy production from one sector by reducing energy production in another? Or to put a finer point on it, are we talking about incentivizing financially one sector while by changing the tax policies, by increasing taxes on another sector? Because when you start distorting markets like that, that's when you start having difficulty in terms of meeting supply, and you get into the potential for price shocks. And so certainly that's something that you want to avoid, at least in my opinion. So those are the three things that I'm going to be looking for in particular to try to identify what the true differences are. Again, top-level rhetoric, they're both going to say we need it all. But underneath the surface, you're going to see some very, very pointed distinctions between the two programs. That's what I'll be looking for.
Thank you very much. Mike?
Thanks very much. That was a very impressive list of questions. I'm not sure I can even remember how many there were, but it was great. Let me just say a word about PPI first. We're a centrist poly organization in a world in which centrism seems to have either disappeared or more precisely become suppressed. I think when we talk to people, there's an awful lot of interest in what might be called centrist ideas that is temporarily being held out of the policy conversation. I characterize us as pro-growth, pro-innovation, pro-production, in a progressive context, because we believe that growth is beneficial for everyone. In terms of where we think the candidates should end up in terms of energy, we call it energy realism, which has three pieces to it. One is an acknowledgement that fossil fuels are going to be part of a balanced energy portfolio as far as the eye can see. Another leg of the stool is an emphasis on the economic impact of the energy industry. And people usually talk about this in terms of jobs. We think about this in terms of investment, because investment reflects both jobs and also higher productivity. We recently did a paper on investment heroes. That is, the companies, U.S. companies that are investing the most in the U.S. And out of the top 10 investment heroes, 5 of them were energy companies, investing a total of $43 billion in 2011 in the U.S., which is really incredibly impressive considering that we're still in the middle of an investment drought. And the third leg of the stool of energy realism is the need to acknowledge global warming as a real issue and to address it very dynamically through a combination of technology and also some form of cap or tax to be sort of worked out and made to work better. We at PPI are not anti-regulation, but pro-regulation that works, and we've put a lot of work into thinking about ways of making regulations work better. We've also put a lot of work into thinking about technology and how to incent that. And you sort of mentioned the role of the fiscal issues. You know, the fact is the majority of the fiscal issues has to do with things like health care. And the U.S. can't afford to not spend money on what we need, whether it's boosting technology or incenting the types of production that we need in the U.S. And so, you know, when we talk about energy realism and what we're looking for from the candidates is both practical realism and also political realism. That kind of sums that up here. I didn't answer most of your question. I'm sure we'll get back to them.
You answered all of them. Kevin?
Good morning, and I appreciate the invitation from the American Petroleum Institute to serve on the panel here. And I should probably mention that while I've been doing renewable energy for the last almost a decade or so, most of my career I spent in conventional energy, largely natural gas-fired electricity facilities. I spent a fair amount of time on the nuclear side as well earlier in my career. Moved from conventional energy into wind in 2004 and built a number of facilities in the U.S. and internationally, and then moved into the solar space in 2008. And when I look and you know imagine the topics that should be covered under the presidential debates and the topics that we should cover here today, there's kind of 4 main categories. One is policy, okay, and not policy for next year, policy for the year after, policy during this presidential cycle, long-term policy. What are we going to do over the next 20 years, 30 years? You know, there's been discussions about and I think API's own estimates talk about world energy requirements going up 50% over the next 20 to 25 years, and how we're going to address that. Other countries around the world are addressing that. The Chinese, the Germans, the French, the Brazilians, the South Africans, the Saudis are all looking at 20, 30, 40, even 50-year plans. I mean, Germany is looking at 80% renewable energy by 2050. What's our plan in 2050? Okay. So I think when we look at policy, we have to look not only at short-term issues on job creation, things like that. We got to look at what is our long-term policy. So that's kind of item number one. And item number two, which is a word that's thrown around a lot, energy independence. What does that mean? Does it just mean that we gather our energy from our own backyard, or does it mean that we're independent from geopolitical forces, from supply and demand pressure on pricing, those kinds of things? Certainly in my definition of energy independence, all those things come into play. You know, how do we react? What happens to the prices of energy in the U.S. Under various geopolitical situations and constraints as we look at the Chinese and the Indians taking massively increased positions in energy over the next several decades? So that's item number two, is energy independence. Item number three is obviously the environmental issues. Not just climate change issues. Obviously, climate change is something that we need to address as a nation, but, you know, things in our own backyard, emissions, water use, you know, disruptions in land, you know, all those kinds of things have to be rolled into our overall energy strategy. And then the last one of the 4 points is jobs and economic growth, and how do we trade off each of those issues with short-term issues regarding job creation. I think it's interesting, and I agree, Kyle, that the solar industry is a pretty tiny industry. But I think it's interesting to point out that the JAXA, that the petroleum industry created about 100,000 jobs in this kind of very severe downturn period. The solar industry, as small as we are, created about 100,000 jobs as well. And we come from a massively, massively smaller base. So we believe that the renewable energy industry, and particularly in our area in solar, can create a tremendous amount of jobs in the U.S. and allow us to create products that we can export internationally. You know, we talked about, I'm not going to do a SolarReserve pitch on our storage technology, but that's a U.S. developed technology that can be manufactured in the U.S. and exported around the world, and that's what we're looking to do. And all of these 4 points, the energy independence, environmental issues, long-term energy policy, and jobs, we need to see how all those play together and look at kind of an all-of-the-above strategy when we look at energy supply.
Frank?
Thanks. Okay, so one of the advantages of going last on a panel like this is that I think there's general agreement on what the approaches ought to be. So instead, I've kind of changed my view of what I was going to do here and talk about putting it in perspective, right? So the United States, in the current climate, we're now 80% self-sufficient. I don't like the term energy independence, and I agree with Charlie. I think this notion that we're not going to be impacted by what goes on in the globe unless we institute price controls and restrictions on exports, which is I don't think where we're going, doesn't make a lot of sense. And a lot of people throw it around without using the full import or realizing the full import. We were 70% self-sufficient a decade ago. We're 80% now. Our oil and gas production is up tremendously. Oil production is up highest levels since the mid-'90s. We're the number one gas producer in the world. We have we're Saudi Arabia of coal, right? And so that resource isn't going anywhere. We have the biggest nuclear fleet in the world. Our renewables are roughly 10% and growing. The base is small, but they're an important piece. And the energy policy has to be both current but also forward-looking, as several people have just said. We view ourselves, Mike, kind of as the radical middle, right? So we find people on both sides of the spectrum here in energy policy going forward. There's a lot more stakeholders. There's an economic piece, foreign policy piece, an environmental piece, clearly. There's local and state and federal regulation. There's the timing of this. And I would dispute a few things that were said earlier. So this notion of over-regulation in the United States. Companies have come back to the United States, and it's a consequence of access to resources, clearly. But hydraulic fracturing and extended length lateral wells only took place in a high-price environment. You wouldn't have seen this take place at $25 or $30 oil. So we need to bear that in mind. The same for gas. You know, it took off at $12 or $13. Now the economies, as we've learned more about the structures, we're able to continue to produce. And it's a wonderful resource. We just have to figure out how to manage it. But we're doing this against a background geopolitically of changing demand centers, right? So it's the non-OECD that's growing now. We have institutions that in some cases I think have outlived their usefulness. So the IEA and the OECD, maybe not the best way if you don't have China and India to talk about energy demand. The transformational impact of these unconventionals, I think, is phenomenal, right? So I think it may be a stretch to say the United States is the new Middle East. In demand, we already exceed the Middle East. On supply, we've got a ways to go yet. But what does all that mean, right? So this notion of let me back up. The last 40 years, our energy policy in this country has been predicated on 2 pillars, right? And it's basically rising demand and resource scarcity. And now we're in a situation, especially on the oil side, where we're looking at flat or maybe declining demand and this enormous resource base. And we haven't figured out what we want to do with it yet. And so I agree on the regulatory side. You don't want lax regulation. You don't want over-regulation. It's kind of the Goldilocks phenomenon. It's finding something just right. I agree with the panelists that climate change hasn't gone away, and it's going to come back. And just like state and local issues, I believe in state regulation closer to the surface, but you also see local communities struggling with some of these impacts. You know, out west, population density is maybe 5 people an acre. Pennsylvania, it's 60,000 people an acre. Totally different community impacts. And the final piece I would talk about is the great dilemma. So what do we do going forward? If we build out this infrastructure and we use energy to reindustrialize the United States, what does that do to foreign policy, economic growth? What does it do to the environment? What does it do to water? And that's where the balance has to come in. So I would argue that the regulations have to be flexible and adaptive. They ought to be responsible and reasonable. They ought to advance to newest technology, and maybe we need to do more in the way of performance-based than prescriptive, right? And I agree that this tax discussion and the fiscal discussion is going to limit our possibilities. But the future to me is bright because we've got so many more options. Right? So climate change will be there, but we just bought ourselves some breathing space to figure out where we want to go.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Let me throw out to the panel, Kevin, you raised the point that many countries around the world have long-term energy strategies. You cite the example of Germany, of course, particularly in the wake of their phase-out of nuclear power, and countries around the world. And we all think this sounds great. My God, these countries have an energy policy. We don't. The question I have, as long as you have an energy system that relies predominantly on free market investments and not by a government-directed entity like so many of these other countries do, how do we have a sustainable long-term energy policy that makes sense for the nation when these decisions are all being made every day by private sector actors?
Well, I mean, to say that we have kind of truly free market is probably really not all that accurate. I mean, if you look at what's happened over the last 100 years, and we talk about today whether we're picking winners and losers, we've been picking winners and losers for decades. Okay, we have directed policy. We have whether you want to call them subsidies or tax credits. You know, the conventional energy markets, oil, natural gas, nuclear, coal, have received hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of directed tax subsidies and tax credits to try and drive our energy policy, and we continue to do that. I mean, you know, when you look at the way our energy policy is today, you know, there are encouragement on the natural gas sector. There's special tax credits for you know, innovative fuels. There's you know, all kinds of programs and policies that we can put in place to direct that. You know, are we less free market than Germany or Japan? You know, I don't think I would draw a distinction between those economies, and those countries are putting in place long-term policies. You know, certainly we're less market-driven than, say, the Saudis, but look at the Saudis. You know, the Saudis have announced a $110 billion solar program. Okay, they've recognized that their oil reserves really should be for export markets. That's what they want to do, is preserve their oil reserves for export markets. You know, when oil goes from $100 a barrel to $500 a barrel, they want to make sure they've got oil they can sell at $500 a barrel. So they're looking at putting in a large scale, up to 30% over the next 15 to 20 years, 30% replacement of electricity generation with solar, to save those oil reserves for export markets. You know, is that the policy that we want to look at? Maybe, but it's certainly a little bit sobering when we look at the number one oil producer putting in a big solar program so it can save its oil for export markets. So we can direct policy. Yes, we have generally a free market. If we wait and just let the free market decide, then we're gonna be in a .com kind of problem potentially. These are long-term markets. These are issues that are incredibly important to the U.S. We should just not let the markets decide what they're going to do, because we're going to find ourselves looking back in 20 years with the wrong solution.
Would anyone support, did anyone else want to add to that initial question?
Let me just add one thing here, which is that if you compare U.S. government investment in bio R&D to its investment in energy R&D, you see this enormous disparity. And so one of the places where a government role is important, I think, is in putting more, maintaining and increasing our investment in energy R&D, which improves our capabilities going forward into the future no matter what happens. Having said that, it's very hard to make a plan when we have unanticipated events like the natural gas revolution. If we had put a plan into place 10 years ago, we wouldn't have anticipated that at all.
Given the reality that we have natural gas prices under $3 at the wellhead, do we really believe that there will be something transformative that occurs in the demand for natural gas in the next few years that will lead to a rush of drilling for more natural gas, even if we removed some of the bottlenecks on access to federal lands that Jack highlighted in his remarks? Or is the reality of these prices, people have no incentive to go out and look for more gas?
No, I'll take that. I think there is an incentive to go out and look for more natural gas. Obviously, at these prices, you're not necessarily going to see a significant increase. However, there's going to be increased demand. I mean, we're not talking about an energy source where demand is going to be flat. We're going to see significant demand increase in natural gas because, as we're seeing more manufacturing coming to the U.S. Companies that have been moving offshore are coming back to shore and opening up new facilities here in the United States. There's the potential for increased natural gas in other sectors like the transportation sector. So I don't necessarily think you're going to see a huge spike, but you're going to see a gradual increase in natural gas demand here in the United States. And I think that additional demand will create enough of a market to increase production. Again, not as a spike, but a significant increase over time.
I'll jump in the I think I've been building projects for decades, and I built natural gas-fired projects when it was $2 a million BTU, and built projects when it was $15 a million BTU. And those were in markets where when it was $2, everybody said it's going to be $2 for the foreseeable future, and then a few years later it was 10. So natural gas prices are demand driven. I agree with Frank that the regulatory structure that we have here and permitting activities and things like that, you could argue that they could be relaxed a little bit, but in reality, we've got some pretty sound policy to make sure that we're building large scale projects that make sense and environmental sense. So I don't think relaxing the regulatory structures right now, as you point out, at $2 gas or $3 gas is going to make much of a difference. What's going to make a difference on whether we drill more gas is whether or not demand increases and prices increase. Because right now there isn't a whole lot of incentive for natural gas companies to drill more. Prices are rock bottom. I mean, they've already kind of knocked out the coal industry. I mean, the coal industry is complaining about environmental regulations as well. In reality, they're getting the coal industry is suffering dramatically because of low natural gas prices. I think what's going to increase natural gas drilling is increased prices. And at $3, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. At $10, you're going to see a big rush, regardless of what the environmental and regulatory hurdles are to get there. You're going to see increased drilling when prices rise.
Do we really believe that prices are rising anytime soon? We did a study with a very distinguished set of natural gas experts from around the country that we released in last May. And the purpose of that study was to address the whole issue of exports. And first we looked at, how can we increase domestic demand in other sectors of the economy. We may have been a little light in our analysis on the transportation sector. We were pretty negative about any meaningful change there anytime soon. But we basically concluded that the prospects of natural gas prices rising very much, even between now and 2030, are fairly minuscule. I mean, they will rise, but we're not talking about prices getting back to $7+ by any stretch of the imagination. So, and when you consider inflation during that period, and these were in inflation-adjusted prices, it's a pretty flat demand curve. Now, we can be wrong. I'm not arguing that. But this has certainly appeared to be the direction that the country was moving. And on this same, maybe we can return on this same issue. If we want natural gas demand, I think we all do, to go up at least enough to encourage new production since we have this great bonanza, how do we balance this whole issue between those that argue they want to be able to export LNG because of the jobs it will give in the oil and gas patch on the production side and the ancillary jobs that may be created to build out some of the infrastructure from some of these remote plays to get them where they can be exported, versus the manufacturing community, led particularly by the petrochemical producers, that simply say, well, initially they said no, no, no. And then they went, well, maybe a little bit, or maybe a percentage of production, and it's unclear where they exactly are right now. But there is this tension, because on the one hand, we have this tremendous resource that can very likely reindustrialize America, and make us a cheap cost producer of many industrial goods and services. On the other hand, we have people that are sitting on these valuable resources that would like to export it and see some value added to their companies from there. Does anybody on the panel have a view on how we balance these?
Well, I think it's about timing and sequencing, right? So this is a relatively new phenomenon. I think we'd all agree that. So between, I'd say, 2007 and 2011 or 2012, that first 5-year period, there was a lot of drilling to hold leases. As the price has gone down, so 2007, 2008, we saw $11, $12. Now we're seeing $2. You're not seeing a lot of new drilling in dry gas areas unless it's for the purpose of holding lease. The rig count has switched, and I would argue that we're in a continuum now where you can't talk about gas without talking about liquids and talking about oil, because at some point the midstream and the downstream is what's going to be the limiting factor, and they develop slower than the production profile, right? That said, on the export question, when we were part of the NPC study, 3 years ago, people looked at the gas resource base in the United States and said, well, it's less than a TCF, right, or 1,000 TCF. And then it got to 1,500, then it got to 2,500. The NPC study said 4,000 trillion cubic feet. That was a year and a half ago, and that's now viewed as conservative. I saw Paul just left, but the Canadian group had come down here, and they talked about North America with 10,000 trillion cubic feet of resources. So if you've been in the industry any length of time, this is infinity, and this is 10,000 trillion cubic feet. We just don't know what we want to use it for, and I think you're exactly right. So some people talk about transportation. I see kind of limited role, except for centralized fueling and maybe on some highly trafficked routes. Power generation, petrochemicals, fertilizers, industrial-based fuel source, right? Stripping off the hydrogen, combining it with oil as part of the refining cycle. There's a variety of things, but it's a dynamic structure, and I would argue, and it's the same on the oil side right now, that we're going to see a lot of people look at the macro, and it may be a lot of little micros. So first movers in emerging markets change the dynamics and the price structures for everyone else. And I think that's one. We're now railing on the oil side. We're railing 1 million barrels a day of oil out of the West because our pipeline system goes south-north, because that's what the old system used to be. And now we're looking at going, north-south or going coast-to-coast where the demand centers are. It's going to take a while to catch up with us. And we're in the early process stages. But I think the resource base argues for yes, 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 and yes. We can do all those things. We have to just demonstrate that we can do them in an environmentally sound, safer, smarter, cleaner manner.
Well, maybe I'll jump in real quick. If you look at, say, electricity generation, which is a huge consumer of energy, over the last decade, about 80+% has been natural gas-fired generation. It really has dominated since really for most of my career. I started on the nuclear side on some of the last nuclear plants built. But, you're not going to see a whole lot of nuclear plants built. You're not going to see a whole lot of new coal plants built. They're not very cost effective. You've got environmental issues you've got to worry about, and you've got permitting nightmares on trying to get a nuclear plant or a large coal plant built. So that's why natural gas really has filled in that void. Over the last 5-6 years, the renewable sector has taken almost the balance of the 80%, and very few, like I said, very few coal plants and nuclear plants. So the renewable energy sector right now is the only competition that natural gas has for power generation. But when you look kind of broader, if you look on the issue of exports, okay, personally, philosophically, I believe, yes, you should be able to export. You have a product here, private companies should be able to export. And so the natural gas industry is going to move to an export market. We're our $2 or $3 here compared to, $15 in Europe or $15 in Asia or $12 in Asia, whatever the prices are, there's some pretty big disparities, and we as a nation be able to export those projects, those products into those markets. We then got to worry about, okay, what's our domestic resource, And like I said, look at the model that the Saudis are trying to put in place, which is replacing their domestic source, with a truly kind of independent resource. Now we got a long way to go on solar, but the Germans they've gotten on certain periods up to 50% solar on their system in a pretty short amount of time. So, the question is, how quickly can we do something like that? But, I'm all for exports. I expect that a vast majority of the oil that's processed, if Keystone gets built, is going to be exported. The export markets for natural gas are going to be tremendous in the future. How will they affect natural gas pricing in the U.S.? I don't know. We'll see. But natural gas prices, when it was $2 and when it was $14 over the last 10, 12 years, those swings, it isn't based on pricing to drill. It's based on demand. Okay, so the reason why prices are low now, yes, it's fracking is provided some cheaper ways to drill, but it's really demand, and demand is low right now, and so prices are low, and I believe it will be $6-7 in the next 5 years. Even though the studies say no, I've been through the cycles for 20 years, so I've read the reports for 20 years, and none of them were ever right. But, that's the way it works.
Let me just add a couple of points to what you just said here. I've been working across a variety of different industries for 20 years, looking at price forecasts. And the history of price forecasts in every industry is just terrible. Just if you think about housing, all right, what the forecasts were in housing and sort of what happened. At this point now, the smartest thing, I'm with you, the smartest thing to do is to sort of think about a range of different prices that it could be at, including things that you think it might not be at. And if I look at the global economy at this point, you've got a slowdown in the global economy of a depth that we actually don't understand right now. And the combination, and part of the low prices is coming from that. One more note about manufacturing. The U.S. needs a manufacturing strategy as a whole. It simply isn't enough to sort of say, we're going to keep low-priced energy here to juice up our manufacturing. That has to be part of the strategy. That's not the whole strategy. So a well-balanced manufacturing strategy would include the ability to export as well as the ability to help goose the industries here.
One couple last points. We talked before about having that driver to increase demand so that we are continuing to produce natural gas. Obviously, exports do play a part in that. Kevin's experience notwithstanding, the studies, including government studies, have demonstrated that there probably will not be a significant increase in natural gas price if we have moderate.
The government is always right.
There have also been private studies.
Okay.
They're simply acknowledging what others have said. So we do have an expectation or an anticipation that we're not going to see significant increase in price as a result of export. It will increase demand. It will increase the economic benefits here in the United States of producing that natural gas. So I don't think that there should be any restrictions in terms of export. And let me just mention one other thing that Frank and Jack got to this earlier this morning as well, and that is this notion of relaxing regulations so that we can produce more American energy, whether it's natural gas or oil. To be clear, that the oil and gas industry is not looking to relax regulations on hydraulic fracturing. What we are looking for is to ensure that that the federal government does not overlay additional duplicative regulations on what we're already doing on the states. I do want to make that clarification for the record.
One little point on the price structures. Like I said, I've been watching these cycles for admittedly 30 years really now, but the price of natural gas and the cost of natural gas, or the sale price of natural gas. I mean, look at the oil industry, okay? It does not cost $100 a barrel to take it out of the ground, okay? It costs the Saudis $10, okay? And the oil industry is selling at a premium because of demand, and that market is going to hold true for natural gas as well. As demand increases, as export markets certainly will expand, and as we're continuing to build most of our power generation with natural gas, we'll have some movement into transportation. There's fuel switching right now that's happening on natural gas versus coal. So there will be increases, and the natural gas industry is not going to bubble along at $3. They're just not going to let it happen. Okay. So, like I said, when it was $2 and when it was $14, if you look at natural gas prices over the last 20 years, it is the most volatile fuel out there. It makes oil look pretty tame. from a pricing standpoint. And there's really, people say, oh, fundamental change in the market right now. Yeah, I've heard that. Like I said, I had to build power projects at $14 a million BTU when the people were saying we're running out of natural gas, and that's why prices are so high. We'll see.
So I'm going to make the argument for fundamental change. The shale gas, we're now in source rock, and there's a huge difference. So in the past, we've had to wait till oil and gas migrated to the surface, got trapped by a capstone, stratigraphic trap, and then we went out and found it with various levels of success, onshore and offshore. The fact that we can drill 6-mile deep wells, right, and the fact that we can do laterals that are 2.5, 3 miles long, you can now go down, and once you're in the source rock, these are actually generating hydrocarbons. There's zero geologic risk, right? The fracking technology has improved to the point where you can find the third of the frack picks up, in some cases, 60% of the gas. The second third picks up another 25. Third, maybe you don't even need it. So the economies of scale, we're learning more to extract from the shales than we ever knew before. And this is. The topography is different, the hydrology is different, the geology is different, and it is regional, and we ought to be mindful of that. But I think that there has been a huge change in that, in the way we do that. When people ran at the end of 2011 to drill wells, and we know what one company up in the Marcellus, that between November 15th and the end of the year was going to drill 300 wells to hold their leases. They were going to hook up a third because of the demand and the infrastructure. So the question is how fast do you come back, and what the piece we can't figure out for even short-term pricing, and I agree it's a humbling experience to predict price around here, is whether or not the associated gas with oil and the gas liquids drilling will offset the decline in the dry gas production, right? So what does 2013 look like? And if you're a small, so this is my micro versus macro. If you're a small producer, you got 15 rigs, you've deployed 12 into oil, 3 into natural gas, a 15 or 20 cent increase in gas, if oil's still at $80, is not going to send you back into the gas field, right? So there's a lot that's already there that just needs to be hooked up. We'll run through that, and there will be some. I agree. I think there will be some price movement because there always has to be.
My point is not that there certainly there's a fundamental change in that the supply, there's a tremendous amount of supply, more than we expected, certainly. Okay. My point is really more, we are somewhat of a market-based economy, and if you go to a natural gas producer now and say, okay, you think gas prices are going to be low for the foreseeable future? Yes. I want a $20 contract at $3.
Right.
Okay. No, nobody will do that. Okay. So, they're banking on future price. Maybe you can get a 3-year deal. Okay. That's kind of the extent.
That's just very important. That people are not willing to sort of bet on this. They no matter what they say, they're not willing to bet on it because the cost of being on the wrong side of the volatility is too high.
I was in a conference and the president of Chesapeake was talking about all the changes and the fundamental changes. At the end of his speech, he said, my advice to you guys is to sign long-term contracts. Now, if prices are going to be low for the foreseeable future, that's not the right advice. You don't need a long-term contract if prices are going to stay low. But the other point is he won't even sign a long-term contract. So that's the issue with natural gas. It's a volatile fuel. It's going to be volatile. We need to recognize that, and we need to take advantage of it as a nation. I believe, philosophically, personally, that we should be able to export those products, that we cannot just save them for our own use, although that's certainly very tempting. But we have to come up with supplies that don't have that volatility inherent in the source.
And this comes back to the presidential campaign. And the question you could ask the candidates is, okay, natural gas is a very low price. There's a lot of it. How are you going to make use of it? What are you going to do with this? How are you going to help this to sort of create jobs, create investment, move us on to a better energy footing long term? That's a question that you could ask the candidates right now and get a wide variety of different answers because it doesn't come down to this narrow drill or not drill. It's a 10-year question, and it's also about philosophy, where it might very well be that one candidate says, well, we're not going to do anything with this. We'll just let the market determine. And the other candidate will sort of say, okay, there's things we need to do to move to a more balanced energy portfolio, boost manufacturing, and in the process actually gain some ground on climate change.
Next year, that's hard to believe, only probably some of us in the room are old enough to remember this, but next year it'll be 40 years since the Arab oil embargo of 1973, which of course started the whole renewed concern about U.S. energy policy that continues to bedevil us to this day. How would any of you, given that the whole issue of energy independence, those of us that follow international energy know, has always really centered, although it sometimes gets confusing, on the vulnerability of our economy to disruptions in the transportation sector because of the large percentage that oil is used in the transportation sector. How would any of you advise the candidates on whether they should bite the political bullet and advocate quite strongly for the enactment of a much higher gasoline tax? And before they answer this, let me just show you what a good political barometer I am on this. Back in 1980, again, probably most of you are too young to remember, we had a third-party candidate for President, John Anderson. And I worked on his political campaign. And he was a strong advocate of a gasoline tax, 50 cents a gallon. And amazingly, for a presidential candidate, a third party, we were hovering close to 20% in the polls. And after a group of people wrote this speech for him for a 50-cent gasoline tax, we went to 5. So against that backdrop, my question stands with the panel. And if you were to advocate a gasoline tax, how would you advise the candidates to sell it to the American people?
Well, I certainly wouldn't.
You don't have to be in favor.
I have no advice on how to sell it because I wouldn't support it in the first place. Again, a gasoline tax, you're doing exactly what our industry thinks and many industries think is a poor political move. You're picking winners and losers. You're picking one fuel and you're encouraging other fuels. Obviously, this being in the transportation sector, you're trying to move the market in an artificial way, and when doing that, you're raising prices to consumers, and you're not necessarily going to see a significant tangible benefit in doing so. So we would strongly oppose that type of a gasoline tax, despite the fact that I liked John Anderson back in the day.
Would that be true even if a package could be truly put together where the gasoline tax would be used for deficit reduction?
I think any type of tax that you're talking about increasing, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a gasoline tax, when you're talking about deficit reduction, you really need to look at all the options on the table. I think it's premature to talk about any type of tax being used for deficit reduction unless you're seeing all the various options and all the whether we can reduce spending as an alternative. It's just premature to say that.
I mean, I'm on a few of these issues, maybe on different sides than people would expect. I'm hugely in favor of exporting, our natural gas and our oil. When you look at environmental issues, you got to look at the environmental issues close. You also have to look at the jobs issues close. With respect to a tax, I think that would allow us to act more like we should be acting to a fuel that is tremendously. We're a slave to the market. Okay, and when the question was asked earlier with the interview, they said, why aren't there more high efficiency diesel cars in the U.S.? Why are they all over Europe? Well, that's because Europe pays $8 a gallon for gas, and we're paying a lot less than that. I think putting a tax on gasoline would let us act like the fact that this fuel is going to go up higher and higher and higher as you look forward in the future. With increases of 50% worldwide, oil prices are going to go up pretty dramatically. And we're acting like we're always going to have $4 gas. We need to act like it's going to be $10 gasoline at the pump. And the only way to get people to act like it's going to be $10 is to charge us $10, And so we need to change our actions. We need to change our policy. We need to change our consumption habits. And right now we pay the lowest price for gasoline in the world.
So I would argue that when we talk about reducing import dependence and increasing energy security, that you have to approach it from both sides, from the demand side as well as the supply side. We've chosen, as a matter of public policy, ever since I think Clinton tried to get, a 5-cent gasoline tax too, and it wound up 2 or 3 a long time ago. That's the last time it was raised. But CAFE standards and fuel efficiency, if you can get a 50 or 60 mile to the gallon car, $4 gasoline is $2 gasoline to the consumers. And that's the way we've chosen to approach it, plus supplement with alternative fuels. So gasoline tax may be more transparent. It would be more painful, and this is kind of what the political reality versus what responsible or real options that should be on the table. And I agree. I mean, if we open up the tax debate broader, there's groups around town that have been talking about a carbon tax. And they always break down about, well, how do you spend the money? Because everyone has a way to spend the money. It's not just a gap filler.
If I can add something, I mean, being trained as an economist for many years, a gas tax is just too narrow. I mean, that's what you're saying. Basically, it's distorting the markets. Whether or not you'd like to have a carbon tax or a carbon cap, and use those funds, which are sort of it's a much broader tax, and in a way that it generates money that can be sort of used to support other activities. That's kind of a different question. But I can't. You look at the history of the gas tax in the U.S. and you look at the economics, and this is one case where the politics and the economics point the same way, that it isn't a good idea.
2 final questions, which I'll merge together, and then we'll get Jack back up here for a Q&A session, because I think it would be remiss if we didn't put these on the table. What should the U.S. policy be in our energy mix in the future towards coal and nuclear power? We know that we are the Saudi Arabia of coal, at least in terms of the reserves we have in the ground. This is a tremendous energy resource, particularly if we can find a way to both commercially and technically develop it in a safe environmental way, which to date we have not on a large scale been able to do. And of course, nuclear power, which is extremely emotive to most people, and particularly to many NGOs that work in the energy space here in Washington and the broader world. I think one has to at least put on the table, do we really believe, again, if you believe that climate change is an issue, if you don't, it probably doesn't matter, but can you really forego the development of nuclear power on the scale question that you raised in the past, looking at global electricity needs if we don't develop nuclear reactors? And I would add to that, particularly put our R&D in the small-scale modular nuclear reactors, which pose far less financial risk to the developers of those than do 900 or 1,200 megawatt reactors. So if anybody would like to ruminate on what we should do with these 2 energy sources in our future. Of course, the nuclear issue also raises the waste issue.
Raises lots of issues. I'm going to pass on coal, but go right to nuclear. I think if you look at a U.S. investment in energy R&D, what you see is a real lack, and you see a real lack in nuclear, especially where what happened is that even the willingness to develop the new technologies wasn't there. So, interestingly enough, I actually had a Twitter exchange with somebody on this yesterday or the day before, and I said, well, what you could do is you could sort of mark out an area of the desert, and you allocate this for sort of developers to go out and actually test this. Go and test different designs that may be a little bit off the beaten track, where you're not so much worried about safety at that point. Because what's happened is there's a lot of demands that have been put on the developers that make it very hard to develop the small-scale stuff. And let's just assume that this is a 20-year project for us, so we're kind of going back to zero again. We're going to put a lot of money into this, and assume that down the road, it's not just the safety issue, but it's the cost issue as well. It's just not there against natural gas. That we have to solve this eventually, and we should assume that this is that they're not safe enough now, that we need them safer, we need them to cost less, and that in the medium term they're an essential part of the mix. And that should be our policy. And it's a policy that has to run across different administrations, but it seems to be very important.
I'll jump on both of them real quick. The Certainly my position is the R&D support on both of those technologies should continue, coal and natural gas. I mean coal and nuclear. The concern is that coal's got a very, very tough road ahead. If you look at the mix, and I've been looking at 30-year pro formas on electricity project economics, for decades, and right now it's natural gas, renewables, including solar and wind, coal and nuclear are really just out of the price mix. Forget about the safety issues, which obviously are a big issue, and even the environmental issues. Coal and nuclear just don't make it into the mix. Okay, so if you really want to do market based, then those guys are done. Okay, they're going to continue to operate existing projects, but we're going to go from 40% coal to 35 to 30 to 25 to 20 going forward. It's just not competitive. But the R&D on it should continue because it's really hard to predict what's going to happen over the next 30 or 40 years. And we may find a technology that can make those more cost effective and more environmentally friendly, and that goes for nuclear as well. I mean, the difficulty on nuclear is those projects are it's to build a large scale facility is a 15-year project, and there is not too many utility executives that's going to go to his board and say, I want $10 billion. And we'll start generating 1 kilowatt in 15 years. Okay, it just doesn't work, and the economics on cents per kilowatt hour doesn't work right now either.
The economics have to be improved.
Yeah. So, but that doesn't mean you abandon those technologies. I think you have continued R&D support. It's very difficult to make them work in the market-based economy if you truly want to just squeeze out the projects that don't work. Those two industries are going to have a difficult part in maintaining their existing position and increasing it any shape or form in the future.
It's important to realize that a lot of the pro-climate change folks are actually coming around to the idea of nuclear as being an important part of the mix in the medium and long term. And so if you think about what the U.S. policy. U.S. economic policy is about what do you pick to sort of focus on? And there's going to be all this fiscal pressure to cut back on things. And one thing that we can't cut back on is energy R&D across a wide range of areas. That's a little bit like slitting our throat long run.
Yeah, let me just put in a pitch. So yesterday at CSIS, we actually had a Blue Ribbon Commission that we've been working on. General Scowcroft was one of the chairmen and actually made the pitch along the same lines. That we're fine now, but if you fast forward 30 or 40 years and you don't extend the useful life of some of the facilities we have, that we could be in a position where our nuclear fleet, drops from 104 to 50. Right? And then the question is, what role do we play in a non-proliferation regime going forward if we don't have either the technology, the manpower, or the ability to influence what goes on in the rest of the world? Because other people are still going forward. So there's a national security aspect as well. And I agree. I mean, R&D across the board makes infinite good sense.
Well, I want to thank our panel. I think we're out of time for a very stimulating discussion.
You don't fall off.
I don't want you to push me off.
No, not a chance.
We'll move over a bit to make you more room.
We're fine, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll address where the questions are addressed to a particular individual. I will direct it initially to them, but then ask any of the other panelists if they wish to weigh in what they'd like to say. Glad you could join us, Jack.
Thank you.
First question is directed to you. It says, Mr. Gerard, you talked about oil companies paying their fair share and contributions to the U.S. Treasury, but what about industry subsidies? Shouldn't that also be part of any serious tax discussion?
The factual answer is yes. It should be part of that broader conversation. But I think, Charles, what's most important is that it's a fair and equitable discussion. Earlier you mentioned the food stamp comment. Let me take a little different view on that. The first thing we can do is we put as many people as we can to work, so the demand side of that equation then dissipates or goes away to the extent it can. But on the tax reform issue, we believe in the oil and natural gas industry, we just need to be treated like everybody else. Many people don't realize today we pay an effective tax rate of 40.6%. Now that's compared with the Standard & Poor's Industrials, who pay an average of 25%. Right? We hear the president oftentimes talk about record profits. The most profitable company in the United States today is Apple Computer. They're the largest company and most profitable. But we don't hear any conversation about increasing taxes on those industries. So we need to get away from this picking and penalizing industries and say, what is uniform, positive tax policy across the board? So if we're allowed to recover our costs, other industries should also be allowed to recover their costs. Let's bring the rate down. Let's have uniform tax policy and quit trying to penalize industry based on the tax code.
I'll jump in here, and I think when you look across industries, you can kind of say, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. But there's some pretty fundamental differences between Apple and the oil industry, okay? I mean, the oil industry and the natural gas industry and other electricity production, a lot of that is based on federal lands and based on offshore drilling. I mean, Apple is not utilizing, offshore or onshore federal lands to drill, and to make their product. It's a completely, a private product. I think really you got to look across the energy sector and say, okay, how is oil? What subsidies is oil getting versus renewables versus coal versus nuclear, and look at across those. I mean, there certainly are some significant subsidies that the oil industry is getting that they continue to get on building, the producers that would be the recipients of the Keystone. They have the 179C, 50% tax depreciation in the first year on new equipment. The solar industry, we only have 30, okay? So, and they're trying to take it away. So, you got to look at, it's hard to compare the oil industry and the natural gas industry with the fact that they're really taking resources out of the ground that are, arguably kind of owned by the public, versus a private company like Apple that is not utilizing public lands. And what are the royalties that they're paying for those? And are those royalties competitive? And there was a bill a few months ago in Congress that said, these royalties really are subsidized royalties, and we should raise those royalties. There was a $2 billion, would it be a $2 billion reduction in those subsidies, and it was turned down by Congress, while the subsidies for wind now are expiring at the end of this year, and that's probably about the same order of magnitude.
Yeah, Charles, go ahead, Frank.
I was going to say, so Jack and I agree on this. So, wow, surprised. The federal government, so companies that extract the extractive industries, right? So they pay bonus bids, they pay lease costs, and they pay royalties. So they're actually paying back for the right to do that. So I agree. I mean, I think
depends on the level.
Well, we can talk about the level, right? So at different times, this is the forward-looking versus the reactionary. And forward-looking, if you want, let me make 2 points. On the price side and on the penalty side, one person's subsidy is another person's incentive. We wrote this stuff into the tax code because we thought there was a good reason, both on the solar side and on the conventional fuel side. I totally agree with you that we shouldn't go after 4 or 5 companies just because they're big and give them a special rate. That makes no sense at all. The notion of the market and the playing field, though, it's hard to do a transformation or a transition when existing infrastructure has so much of a market advantage. So at some point, if you think it's in the national interest to build solar or new cars or nuclear, maybe a portion of the federal money ought to go to that because we think that's a gain for everyone, right? So we can't lose sight of the fact that this competing in the fiscal environment that we have, I think there's going to be a lot of competition.
Well, this is kind of the crux of one of the major issues on the energy side, is you've got industries that for decades and decades, I mean, we did pick winners. We picked winners in the coal industry, 75 years ago. We picked winners in the oil and natural gas industry 50 years ago. And those subsidies, I mean, literally, if you look at the amount of money that we've spent in tax subsidies and royalty subsidies and tax credits for drilling for paying royalties overseas and all those kinds of things. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that were put into conventional energy. Okay, now they have that. They've built profitable industries, and those industries are saying, Forget about all that. We don't need any subsidies anymore. Well, great. I'm on board, pull up the ladder, kind of. I mean, it's you've spent 100 years developing those industries. We now have new industries, clean industries that can go forward and change the dynamics. And they're saying, no. Everybody's got to be competitive. Okay, where was that 75 years ago, 50 years ago, when we were pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into those industries?
I think we're adamantly agreeing here.
Yeah.
And what's your policy going forward? You ought to support
that.
Yeah.
Okay, because you need to have some form of subsidies for the nascent industry. Okay, done in a way which is as broad as possible, so you pick up as many different technologies as possible. So yeah, the wind the wind credit shouldn't be cut at this point. We need to sort of grow it out, but we also shouldn't go and punish growing industries at this point. Okay, which is true. It was interesting when PPI did this list of investment heroes. The industries that were sort of filled up the top 10 were companies that filled up the top 10 were telecom and energy, which is two areas that there's been some interest in regulating more tightly. And you ask the question, why in these growing investing industries would you want to increase the regulation? Isn't this a little bit like cutting off your nose to spite your face from an economic point of view? And I think that's definitely true.
And the issue for me isn't so much, take the subsidies away from oil and natural gas. It's that right now the renewable energy, everybody's saying, take those subsidies away from renewables. The renewable industry has short-term programs, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. The solar industry tax credits expire in 2016. The oil industry's tax subsidies never expire. Okay. So, and they've been going on for 50 years. So, why, the difficulties we now have an either or, either we're going to support industry or we're going to support that industry, or we're going to take subsidies away from this group in lieu of this group. So, let's take the subsidies from the oil industry and give it to the renewable energy industry. We've got to stop the kind of the partisan politics and look overall at the energy structure and say, what do we need to do to be successful going forward? And what we've gotten to is, we'll take some of theirs to help our industry. And right now there's a huge amount of backlash to take subsidies away from the renewable energy industry because they only been put in place for short periods of time, and we've got all these other subsidies that are just buried in the tax codes. It's not going to work.
Charles, one last comment, one point of clarification, if I can. And we could carry on this conversation for hours, obviously, back.
No question.
I think a couple key points is, and I'd restate as I stated earlier, the oil and natural gas industry does not get any subsidies in the tax code today. There are cost recovery provisions. Now, Ken will disagree with me on this.
Right, exactly.
But that's why we that's why we ought to go back to the tax code and, in a reform effort, look at uniform cost recovery, et cetera, and treat everybody equally, right? Then, as a matter of public policy, if we need to treat other industries separately from that in a form of a subsidy, as we're getting the two confused here, and that's a matter of public policy. And I'll tell you, the oil and natural gas industry doesn't take a position on that. Unfortunately, some of the debate has digressed down to this we versus them. We're not on that platform having a conversation about it because our view is, as a matter of public policy, if we need to look at the solar industry, take a look at the solar industry. Just don't drag it back into this conversation where you confuse standard tax policy, cost recovery, versus direct subsidies to promote particular industries. So I think that would be a helpful debate going forward to level that and have a true conversation. The last point I'd add, the oil and natural gas industry are significant, in many ways, leaders in the development of the renewable forms of energy. If you look from 2000 to 2010 on technologies to reduce carbon or zero carbon emitting technologies, the federal government spent $43 billion. The oil and gas industry spent $71 billion in the same time frame, and all other industries combined spent $74 billion. So we take second seat to no one when we're talking about new forms of energy, alternative energies, renewable energies. We're truly energy companies across the entire board.
Yeah, but I mean, there's a few things in there. One is the oil and gas companies became very active because it was good policy, okay, because it sold more gas. Okay, BP turned from British Petroleum to the green flour. Okay, I mean, it was a marketing campaign. Let's see where those oil and gas companies what they do going forward. Okay, you want to make a commitment to continue to put billions of dollars going forward?
Yeah,
let's see how that works.
That's a great point, Kevin. Let's see what they're doing now. The president announced a few months ago they're going to invest $17 million in algae. About 2 or 3 years prior to that, ExxonMobil committed $600 million to algae. These companies have been in this for a long time, long before some of the new entrants have come into the marketplace. So we will be here for a long time. We fully expect to. So again, we need to think longer term about the energy policy and not get caught up in these day-to-day activities and put a vision together.
I definitely agree. But
we could go on forever, Charles.
Cut this discussion off, but with the final comment, that there is a moral hazard on the infant industry argument. How long does an industry remain infant? And one of the studies I am personally most embarrassed by that I did nearly 30 years ago for the Renewable Fuels Association and the ethanol industry was arguing that on an infant industry basis, ethanol should get all the tax credits it received. And we know what an absolute disaster that turned into in terms of the cost to the American taxpayer, impact on food production, as we've seen this summer with fuel versus food. So we have to be careful how long we continue these things.
You're not obliged, to bring up 30-year-old studies that you were wrong about.
That's the only one I was ever wrong.
Okay, so I'm glad to hear that.
But thank you. We have a good question here, and it's particularly relevant, I think, as we read the last couple of days that crude prices are plummeting and yet gasoline prices seem to be rising. It says we can talk about exploration and production until we're blue in the face, but at some point we need to refine these resources. Several U.S. refineries have closed with more on the horizon. So what does our energy security do about shrinking refinery capacity? Anybody want to touch that, Frank?
I'll take that. So I actually think that the refinery capacity, our number of refineries have gone down, but our capacity has expanded. Our Gulf Coast refiners are the most sophisticated in the nation. Now, there is going to be a change here when we start bringing light oil out of the mid-continent and heavy oil from Venezuela and Canadian oil sands. Right now, the market isn't working because of stranded supplies. The infrastructure is not built out. But the competition for things like the Keystone or the One Oak pipeline, we're going to move the bottleneck from Cushing to the Gulf Coast, and then we haven't figured out what we're going to do beyond that, right? So it may be that the margins are better to refine light sweet crude if it's at a distressed price, or that you want to use your downstream capacity and refine heavier crudes and still make a lot of distillate for the world. But this is one of those things that's going to change, and it's really a dynamic situation. We are now, and this is interesting, the East Coast refineries last year, and this kind of goes back to the Bakken too. If the Bakken experience had happened before the shale gas, a lot of the East Coast refineries would not have closed. The Libyan situation last year exacerbated things, not because we were buying Libyan crude, but when the Europeans had to find alternatives, they went to Algerian, Nigerian, and Angolan, which is what our East Coast refineries were using. They were spending a lot more money on the crude, and gasoline was the same price. We are now railing Bakken crude to upstate New York and barging it down to Pennsylvania. There's got to be a better way of doing this, and it will happen over time. But our gasoline prices are different from our crude prices because it's a product pull right now. We had a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Refineries started going into the maintenance season. At certain points, product stocks were low because they anticipated running crude through, and there was a scramble for product. So product prices, especially diesel, if we have a cold snap early this year, I think diesel prices rise, and that's a bigger problem than global crude prices rising actually at this point. But they're two separate markets.
But fundamentally, though, I mean, when we talk about energy independence, the answer to energy independence isn't more oil. Okay, we will never be energy independent as long as we're to have a substantial, as all the forecasts say, we're going to continue to be substantially dependent on oil and natural gas going forward. Natural gas is a little bit more of a constrained market because there's only so much that's going to be exported. But oil prices, we are slaves to the world oil prices. So, unless, which I'm certainly not advocating, I'm certainly sure none of the candidates are advocating, unless we nationalize our oil system so that when world prices go to 500, we can sell it to the U.S. Consumers for 100. That's not going to happen. When oil prices go, regardless of whether we're producing 50% of our use or 100% of our use, when world prices go to $500 a barrel, we pay $500 a barrel. So there is not energy independence in that kind of a forecast.
This is a question referring to the discussion during the first panel. It says, can you expand on what President Obama can do unilaterally to increase domestic energy production and jobs? I think that point was made, as I recall, the first panel, Jack.
Yeah, I'll let me take a shot at it and let others add to it. Under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Acts, it's primarily within the responsibility of the administration to develop what's called the 5-year plan, which is a leasing plan where they identify tracts that they're going to put up for lease and eventually put into the marketplace. So once again, it's fascinating. If you look back in 2007, Frank and I might have a little different view of this, of the economics. You'll remember then when the price of gasoline was starting to push $4 a gallon, and then President Bush made an announcement that he was going to lift the 35-year-old moratorium that existed at the time, and the price of crude oil dropped about $13 or $14 over the course of 3 or 4 days. So we believe two things. Number one, by opening up those areas or sending the signal to the marketplace that it will have an impact. Back to Kevin's point, we can't control the price of crude oil on a global basis, but the one area we do have control over is what we contribute to the supply. And while we might not believe, I think as Frank and others have said, that energy independence is the ultimate answer, our contribution to that global framework, that global supply, is something we should focus on. And that's added supply. So the President has within his ability, his authority, unilaterally, to pick and identify more of those tracts of lands to bring to the marketplace. And so we think that's one of the areas he should focus on and should move quickly. Since he's taken over, they've placed off limits about 85% of the Outer Continental Shelf and other parts on shore, on land. So we think that needs to be reversed, and a true all-of-the-above energy strategy would suggest oil and gas is of equal importance to the other forms.
I'm gonna partially agree with that, okay? Because I think actually that you know, but my view is we should drill more because we should export more because that's good for U.S. taxes, it's good for U.S. jobs. I think we need to be extremely cautious when we talk about releasing you know, more offshore or waters. But if we actually think that that's gonna affect our energy independence or world oil prices, we'll be kind of sadly mistaken. The amount that we could increase in drilling, and when you look at the increase in demand that's going to come from the Chinas and the Indians and the others, it's going to dwarf anything we can do. Even if we doubled our supply of the U.S. over the next 20 or 30 years, it's not going to affect world oil prices very much, and world oil prices are still going to go up fairly dramatically. So the issue is what's our alternative? You know, what alternative sources are we providing, and how can we get those to be meaningfully portions? Like I said, I'm using the German example. You know, they've gone to 20% renewables, expect to go to 30 by 2020, and by 80% by 2050. Okay, that's a dramatic change in their energy mix. Okay, going from us supplying 10% of the world's oil to 12% of the world's oil, when the world's oil requirements are going to go up by 50%, is not going to make a big impact on what we do over the next 30 or 40 years.
So this is short game versus long game, right?
It is.
All right. So, but on the short game part, so I'm with Jack on the short game part. So on the short game part, this notion that just from the Bakken, so our light oil increases in this country over the last couple of years, 700,000 barrels a day. Largest increment over the last 3 years of anybody in the world. It's allowed us actually to perpetuate the sanctions on Iran pretty effectively. If we were still down another 1 million barrels a day, it would have come out of Saudi spare capacity. Not a good thing. The point that you raised earlier, going back to the Bush announcement, we went back and looked at that in detail. So President Bush did make an announcement in, what was it, July of 2008?
Yeah, in that window.
All right, July of 2008. So
June, July.
It was, I want to say it was like July 6th or July 16th, something like that. But prices were in free fall from like the end of June. They hit a high of $147. They dropped to $38 by December. So at any point in time, you could say, well, this week prices went down, you know, $15 a barrel, because they literally went down $100 over that period. I don't give as much credibility to him saying, well, you know, we're going to bring on supply in the next 5 years that accounted for that increase.
Do you think that contributes at all, Frank, to the pressure, the downward pressure on the price?
No, so I think the market is more complex. The old fundamentals of current supply, demand, and inventory are given way to current expectations and future expectations, but there's so much other stuff in there. crude quality, refinery availability, stock, geopolitics, market momentum.
So you don't think it has any impact at all on the global price?
So I don't think you can say that it accounted for $16 in an announcement. Right?
we might not give it all the credit, but clearly to the marketplace,
So as it's
a
falling,
signal.
it was a point in time.
Yeah. Well, we can look at that.
Okay.
The numbers show that it was moving to stabilize and then began to come off. So
Before he announced.
We'll talk about that.
I'll show you the numbers.
Well, that's what the numbers show.
The numbers showed it fell before.
It was near the peak.
It was right near the peak when the announcement was made.
We have a
was up
couple
2
more.
weeks later.
We have a couple more questions.
ahead, Charles.
I wanna
We're
make
sorry.
sure that we sure get in. I'm not sure I fully understand this question, but it seems to be that questioning what possible issues are they that we really don't know about shale gas fracking.
That's an excellent question.
And particularly any ancillary impacts apart from the direct production process.
Yeah,
Anybody want to touch that?
I think this is almost the flip side of not being able to forecast prices, that you have to stay open to the possibility that the environmental considerations are different than we expect them to be right now. If we're anticipating this to be part of our long-term energy supply, we have to remain open to these possibilities. This is part of energy realism. You can't go too far one side. You can't go too far the other side. You can't say that. This is obviously a plus for the economy and a plus for energy independence. On the other hand, we have to stay attentive to our potential need to develop or improve current technologies. So it doesn't have to be apocalyptic. We just have to be aware that the consequences may be more or different than we expect, and continue to sort of look at improved technologies.
I think we maybe I'll use this question a little bit. We haven't talked much about environmental issues and comparing technologies on environmental issues. We've been talking mostly about economics and long-term policy and things like that. But all of these technologies certainly have environmental consequences. Even though we're generating, 80, new projects, I mentioned natural gas electricity generation is kind of dominating our portfolio over the last 10 years. And that's better than coal, but natural gas-fired projects still have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tons of emissions that are put into the atmosphere. 50% better than coal, okay? But coal is a pretty dirty fuel. So we've got to look at all those environmental issues. I think the issue that Kyle raised about we don't want additional regulations on fracking. There hasn't been much to date. They've kind of slipped through pretty unscathed on regulations. When companies, now I'm speaking a little bit more as a layman, when I hear that the companies don't have to disclose the liquids that they pump into the ground, I don't understand that. I've been permitting projects for decades, and you got to tell everything, okay? And it's got to be and it's publicly available, and it's on the website from the California Energy Commission, and I don't understand how you can permit something where you put liquids into the ground and you don't tell what's in the liquids. That's crazy, okay? And that's not spoken as an environmentalist or an energy guy. It's just a guy reading the newspaper. So, you've got to look at those things. We've got to understand what the effects are on the environment and the methane releases and all the things that you hear about, water consumption. Those things all need to be kind of fully evaluated and disclosed.
And what you're talking about here is a dispassionate analysis, not one that's politically balanced at one side or the other. You're actually talking about going and looking, seeing what the consequences are from dispassionately and balanced, and then making improvements if you need to, without getting swept up in the rhetoric of either side. This is actually something that we at PPI feel really very strongly about, because sitting where we're sitting in a centrist progressive sense, it's very important for us to be attuned both to the economics, the need for better energy supplies, but also to be attuned to the potential environmental consequences as well, and saying, look, there's ways of dealing with this that don't run you into people crying apocalypse, okay? But you can look at it, come to conclusions. We know we need this energy-wise. We know that technology improves. That's how we got to fracking. It may need to be improved some more. We don't know at this point. It's something that we have to take a look at.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Charles, let me just clarify something once again. The industry does disclose. In fact, we've created what we call Frac Focus, where the industry stepped forward, put together a program where we go out and disclose exactly what it is we're doing. and we disclose that so anybody can go on the website and look at it. Secondarily, the states have stepped into that quickly, and many have put in regulatory regimes already, long before the federal government talking about it. So I don't want people to think somehow that industry doesn't disclose what they're doing. We do disclose. We comply with the other environmental laws as part of it. So industry has stepped forward on their own. We've developed best practices, best means to make sure the public understands. A lot of the conversation around this, which might be confusing some, is the proprietary nature of the additives that we put into the operations. It's a little bit like Coke. Coke discloses on the back of the can, here's what's in this. But they don't say precisely how they've done that ingredient. And that's an important consideration. It gets back to intellectual property, gets back to proprietary things. That's where a lot of the discussion has occurred with the regulator.
But that's changing, and you would even admit that had the industry stepped up, 3 years ago and nipped this in the bud, it could have taken the issue off the table. Would you not?
Well, frac focus has been around how long, Kyle? 2 years?
2 years.
No, but before that. I mean, so this notion of publicly disclosing beyond MSDS sheets, it struck me as that was...
Well, I think, Frank, the answer to that is it depends on where our critics will go next in terms of where they're going to... Their first issue was, gee, what's going on down there? Once all that was disclosed, then they moved to the surface. Then
this is the whack-a-mole. So going back in the climate change piece, though, and this is, I think, is a problem with some of the natural gas arguments. For those environmentalists that believe the catastrophic impacts of climate change hit you, pick a date, 2030, right? The 2008 Obama campaign that was focused on transformation, cleaner fuels, I don't think they got the whole story on the oil and gas piece, but I think they have it now. It was a situation of how do you perpetuate a move to a lower carbon economy without perpetuating fossil fuels. And when gas looked to be cleaner than coal, and maybe we had the resources for 30 years, it was a really nice bridge. When we come up with 100 years or 200 years, it scares the sweet bejesus out of folks. It's like, oh, my God, it's never going away. And then on the back of that, we found this enormous oil resource, and they're stacked. So below the Marcellus, you have the Utica. Below the Utica, you have the Ordovician. Out in the Bakken, you have the upper, lower, and middle-level Bakkens, and then you have layers below that. We could be producing from these areas for a long, long time. And we have no plan. So this goes back to your point about how we make this transformation and how we so our point has always been push the envelope, promote the future fuels through research development, what's environmentally sound, what's economically affordable, but keep the conventional system robust until you get there, because it's going to be a longer time than you think it's going to be, and that just makes good economic sense.
That's true all the above.
That is true all the above.
I'm getting signals that has to be the last word. I want to thank API for sponsoring this very vigorous and exciting forum, and hopefully we've all taken away something from it. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.